So good morning, everyone, and it's a particularly early good morning from me in Australia, where it's just gone a couple of clicks past midnight on Wednesday morning. So if I get confused between day and night, you know what's happening. As Jeff said, my name is Dr. Jacqueline Drew, and over the last 20 years, I've worked as a psychologist in Australian police agencies, and now as a policing scholar with the Griffith Criminology Institute at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. So I'm passionate really about the mental health of our police officers, and importantly also the training of our police leaders in that space. And also excited over the last little while starting to collaborate with people like Dr. Jeff Thompson at NYPD and Sherry Martin of the Fraternal Order of Police, who, as many of you know, is the National Director of Wellness Services, and really has provided that opportunity to draw on the work that I've done with Australian police officers and now hopefully positively contribute that work to the mental health and wellbeing of members of our global police family and specifically our brothers and sisters in the United States law enforcement. So it really is my pleasure this morning to be moderating this session, and I hope we can resume our travel sometime soon to meet face-to-face as international colleagues in the near future. But for now, we'll make use of technology the best we can and continue to stretch our expertise and research in virtual forums like this, which I think is fantastic. So Jeff has reminded you that the session is being recorded and it will be uploaded on YouTube at some point, and he's given you the hashtags of Twitter and all of those sort of things, which he is fantastic at doing. So we are on a tight time frame. So I'll move to introduce our first speaker. So each speaker has about 12 minutes, not the 11. I'll give you 12 instead of the 11 odd minutes that Jeff told you about. I'll turn my video on about 2 minutes before you're to wrap up. So if you see me pop onto the screen, you just acknowledge me, and then you know you've got 2 minutes to go. I'll turn my video off and then come back at the 12-minute mark. So we will move from each speaker fairly quickly, so there won't be any wrap up at the end of each speaker, but I'll do a general overview at the end once all of our speakers have had the opportunity to present. So our first panelist is Dr. Jennifer Wild. Dr. Wild is an associate professor at the University of Oxford and a senior research fellow in the NIHR Oxford Biomedical Research Centre. Dr. Wild, I'll now hand over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share screen and get this PowerPoint started. So it's just taking a couple minutes. So I wanted to thank Jeff Thompson for arranging this police symposium, and also Jackie for your lovely introduction. And I'm probably going to speak quickly because I thought I had 15 minutes, but it's 12 minutes. So my area of research is risk and resilience in UK emergency responders, and that's what I'll focus on today. But I'd like to start with a story and of someone who demonstrates resilience. And you may be familiar with Captain Joshua Mance. He's an American soldier. We've often thought that resilience is defined as the ability to bounce back from setbacks, but what my research is really showing is that resilience is a behavior. So it's about navigating the aftermath of difficult events in such a way that you stay well afterwards, or you prevent the development of something like post-traumatic stress, or you may even develop post-traumatic stress, but you recover from it, or you may develop some other difficulties, but you recover from them. So resilience is about staying well in difficult times. And the research that I'm going to talk you through today really sees it as a behavior. And I'd like to come back to Joshua now. I first heard him speak in an interview on the radio, actually in the UK. And his interview instantly caught my attention. He had been serving on a humanitarian aid mission in Iraq. He'd been handing out toys to children, and he was shot in a sniper attack, which killed his staff sergeant, Marlon Harper. And a .50 caliber bullet instantly killed Marlon Harper, sadly, and landed in Joshua's right leg, severing his femoral artery. And Joshua died for 15 minutes. He was rushed to the Army hospital, and the brigade surgeon worked on him for quite some time, trying to resuscitate him, shocking his heart, injecting adrenaline into him. And every 3 minutes he was doing this. And then after 15 minutes, he got a faint pulse return. And he was aware that Joshua was probably going to be brain damaged because he had resuscitated him for more than 6 minutes and the heart rate didn't come back until 15 minutes. However, the miracle is that Josh was not brain damaged. He is a very fit and healthy man who fully remembered what he went through in that experience of being shot and resuscitated. He survived his attack with a wounded leg and the death of a very close comrade. And he made it his mission to seek out CNN, Fox TV, ABC, and the New York Times, which is where you may be familiar with him, in order to appeal to US Congress to increase funds for US troops to support their emotional recovery from combat. And he's now a major contributor to the Wounded Warriors program. So Joshua recovered from his trauma. He did develop PTSD, and he did recover from the injury. Can you still see my slides?
Dr. Wild, it's just, I'm just jumping in. Your screen was a little bit frozen. I don't know if you just want to try one more time with the slides. Totally up to you. I apologize for jumping in.
You can't see them.
It was only a fraction. It looked like it froze for us, so that's why I stopped it. Don't worry, this isn't taken away from your time. And okay. I was wrong before. You guys do have just under 15 minutes because you're a 3-person panel. Your screen is working, so all is good in the world again. Back to you, Dr. Wild.
Yeah, so are you seeing this as a full screen or as a kind of presenter view?
No, it looks like full screen to me. I don't know, Jackie, it looks good to you?
Yeah, great. So yeah, Joshua overcame PTSD. He rebuilt his life in response to his injury. And there were a number of things he did. So he stopped dwelling about what had happened. He updated his memory. He frequently broke the link between the present and the past and how he responded to reminders of what had happened in the shooting. And he developed helpful beliefs about coping. So this really leads to the question, do any of these tools that he used improve resilience to traumatic stress? And specifically, do the tools that make soldiers resilient to stress apply to emergency workers? And I think in order to answer that question, we first have to understand what predicts post-traumatic stress and depression in emergency workers. So we've done extensive research in this area. We've done a prospective study with almost 500 London ambulance service workers, so London paramedics. They're almost an even split between men and women, mostly white with an average age of 30. And we assessed these paramedics coming into service at the start of their career on a number of personality and psychological variables. We were really interested in discovering what are the modifiable what are the predictors we can change? So what predicts when people will become unwell, and can we train them, or can we change those modifiable predictors? So there are a number of predictors that are fixed, for example, such as age and sex, for example, are considered fixed factors, and the modifiable ones are more or less the psychological factors. And we discovered something fascinating. So what we discovered was there were 2 modifiable predictors, and rumination, so dwelling about past events, predicted an episode of PTSD, and someone's what we call resilience appraisals, or their thoughts about their own resilience, predicted an episode of depression. So if somebody was joining the service as a paramedic and thought they weren't a great coper, they were much more likely to develop depression. And this had an impact. So developing an episode of post-traumatic stress or depression within the first 2 years of joining the service meant that with PTSD, people had more time off work, they had significant weight gain, clinically significant insomnia, burnout, and a lower quality of life than people who never developed an episode of PTSD. And then with depression, it was a very similar picture, except that people who had developed an episode of depression didn't gain a significant amount of weight that would put them at risk of future cardiovascular problems. But it affected most areas of their life with time off work, burnout, and poor quality of life, for example. So really significant impact of having developed these mental health difficulties. So we then, realizing that there were predictors that led to post-traumatic stress and depression that could potentially be modified, we wanted to know what was out there and do existing programs work. So we paired up with a mental health charity called Mind, And they had been given a resilience intervention that had been developed for the Army. It was a 6-week group intervention. It was mostly quite stress focused, like understanding anxiety and stress and learning how to relax and things like that. So it was quite a loose group. And we were just evaluating it to see if it made a difference. So we compared it in a randomized controlled trial to psychoeducation, where people in the psychoeducation group read about stress 1 week, sleep the next, then depression, then anger, then mindfulness, then PTSD. And then people in the resilience intervention went to a group once a week. And what we found, well, the people who took part firstly were mostly police officers. That was the majority of the sample, followed by paramedics, firefighters, and search and rescue personnel. And it took place across 9 sites across England. So it was a very large study. We looked at 430 emergency responders. And the question I'm getting to is, did it work? And interestingly, it did not work. So what you'll see on this slide is that people did not reliably improve. So they didn't reliably improve on all of the measures that we were measuring. Interestingly, they rated it very positively, but there was no clinically significant or reliable improvement on any of the measures. So the intervention performed as well as psychoeducation, and both of those did not perform very well, unfortunately. So we were then a bit stumped, and we were wondering, there's so much out there. We then conducted a systematic review looking at, there are a lot of resilience interventions out there. Do they work? And of the ones that do work, what are the commonalities? And what we discovered was that of the interventions that help to improve resilience, they tend to target the modifiable risk factors for becoming unwell. So on this slide, you'll see the bottom bullet point says behavioral disengagement, which is really another word for avoidance. And we can target sort of avoidant behaviors with training. So that's something that we can change, and it can predict trauma-related psychiatric problems. So it's really the modifiable predictors that need to be targeted. At least this is what came out of this review that we've just published. So we then went back to our own research results, and we designed a 4-week resilience intervention, which was mixed between completing a module online, which would target rumination or dwelling or resilience appraisals, followed by a group. We'd also included work on how to deal with unwanted memories and difficult emotions. And we then evaluated this in a randomized controlled trial with 180 emergency workers. And again, this was across many sites across England. And this sample was slightly more female than men. And what we found, well, we compared it again to psychoeducation. So 4 topics, read 1 topic per week for 4 weeks. And what we found was that this seemed to be a more promising approach. So you'll see on this slide, the blue line represents the outcome for the resilience intervention. So we see resilience going up over time. The red line is psychoeducation. We see that coming down over time. So people who had psychoeducation had a drop in resilience. And the green line is people who they didn't have access to any of the information, so they waited essentially, and so their resilience drops over time. But the resilience intervention, the blue line, goes up over time. We also looked at psychological well-being, and we had similar findings with that. So people in the resilience intervention, their psychological well-being improved over time. The psychoeducation group, which is the red, dropped over time, and the wait list kind of dropped as well over time. And we were also interested in psychological distress, which is what the General Health Questionnaire measures. And you'll see on this that the resilience intervention led to lower psychological distress over time, yet the other 2 comparison groups, the wait lists and psychoeducation, had increases in psychological distress over time. And then finally, confidence to manage mental health, which is what our funder was interested in. We see with the resilience intervention that people were more likely to feel confident in managing their mental health, but when they were allocated to psychoeducation or wait lists, they had a drop in being able to manage their mental health, or it didn't change significantly. So in summary, post-traumatic stress and depression can be predicted before they develop. And early predictors of later problems in emergency workers that we've identified in our UK cohort are rumination, and that predicts post-traumatic stress. This is dwelling about the past, predicts post-traumatic stress disorder at a future date. And then poor resilience appraisals predicts depression at a future date. And of the resilience interventions that we've looked at, the ones that are most effective, including the ones that we've developed, target these modifiable risk factors. And it seems that we can improve resilience to stress and post-traumatic stress and depression with evidence-based and tested interventions. So I'm going to stop very shortly, and this is the team I'd like to thank and the funders that I've worked with. And also just to say, Joshua Mance is a case study, and all of the tools that are covered in these resilience interventions are also covered in this book here called Be Extraordinary. So I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Dr. Wild, for a great presentation and some key insights about how research can really tell us some interesting things when we commit to evaluating the programs that we're looking at. So I'd now like to move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dr. Tabinia, who is an assistant researcher at the University of California in Irvine. And if you'd like to share your screen and begin your presentation when you're ready, thank you.
Great, thank you. I am, let's see. Okay. 1 second. Okay. There we go. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for making it to this symposium and this session of the symposium. I'm very excited and grateful to be here to speak with you about the neuroscience of building resilience. I'm defining resilience very broadly, not just in terms of improvements in mental health symptomology, but also just increased well-being in those who are mentally healthy. My roadmap for today's talk is simple. It has just 2 parts. I'm going to start by going over the impact of stress and coping on the brain, and then I'll talk about some specific evidence-based strategies for boosting resilience and a little bit about their impact on the brain. One of the main points I want to make in this talk is that it's important to start taking action now, right? That's a theme of this symposium, to start getting proactive today to boost resilience. And to make this point, it helps if we first considered how the brain processes stress and emotions. So here we're looking at a side view of the brain. The nose of the person is on the right. And in red, I'm showing parts of the primitive brain, specifically the amygdala, that's so important for emotions and triggering the fight or flight response, and the basal ganglia that are important for our habitual responses. And in blue, I'm showing the prefrontal cortex. This is our executive brain for higher cognitive functions like decision-making and self-control. Now, in the absence of stress, when a person feels safe and alert, the prefrontal cortex can function normally, allowing it to regulate our thoughts and actions and emotions. This is the basic mechanism underlying emotion regulation and impulse control. But the arrows can point the other way too. The primitive brain can regulate the prefrontal cortex, such as when we're stressed out. So for example, when you're dealing with a suspect and they start to run away or they get aggressive, your reflexive brain takes over, right? Your habits and emotions kick in gear. And this is often a good thing because in a lot of emergencies, there's no time to think. You want your primitive brain to take over because it can act fast. But when a stressor is prolonged or chronic, like funding cuts to your department, it exaggerates this mechanism. And that's a problem because A, stress takes its toll on our physical and mental health, but also the very brain region we need to regulate the stress and emotions is now compromised. So let me explain that a little more. So chronic stress actually leads to physical changes in neurons. It alters brain cells. It enlarges neuron parts in the amygdala, making it hyperactive, and it shrinks neuron parts in the prefrontal cortex and other regions, making them less able to regulate that reactivity. And this leads to impairments in mood and cognitive function and turns into a vicious cycle or a downward spiral where stress impairs prefrontal function, allowing the stress to continue unabated. But some of these changes are reversible if the stress is diminished. And so this is why it's so important to nip stress in the bud before it becomes overwhelming. The good news is that there is a way out of this rut, and it's coping, doing things that can reduce the harm. So just as stress compromises prefrontal circuitry, coping does the opposite. Coping strengthens prefrontal coping circuitry. That's because neurons that fire together wire together, which means brain cells that are active at the same time end up strengthening their connection to each other. So every time you're stressed out and you try to cope, that's depicted on the bottom of the illustration here, the connection between your stress neurons and your coping neurons gets stronger. But if those two sets of brain cells are not active at the same time, their connection does not get strengthened. And the benefit of a stronger connection is that the next time a stressor is encountered, the coping network is recruited more easily. So for instance, rats that are given the opportunity to control a stressful situation show lasting changes in their prefrontal cortex and their amygdala, and they cope better with future stressors, even if that future stressor is different, right? So the coping skill generalizes to new situations. So there's truth to the saying that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And in fact, people with a history of some traumatic experience report better psychological outcomes than people with no traumatic history. And this effect is called stress inoculation, right? So a little bit of stress inoculates or immunizes you to future stress. So the take-home message here is that confronting your stress can not only help you manage the stress at hand, it can also make it easier to manage future stress. This is part of the reason operational training is so important. Right? There's value in exposing trainees to some manageable stress during training so that they have the opportunity to strengthen their coping skills. And it's not just in the rat brain that coping causes lasting beneficial change. There are dozens of coping strategies that boost resilience and change the nervous system in humans. And I'm not going to go over the specific strategies quite yet. Here, I just want to make the point about the importance of neural plasticity. This is the basis of learning. So plasticity and learning are basically the brain changing in response to experience. So in a way, it shouldn't be a surprise that coping changes the brain. All experience impacts the brain in one way or another. But when people realize or are reminded that they can rewire their brains, it boosts their confidence in being able to change. So I think neuroscience should be taught in resilience programs everywhere, but I'm probably biased. But here I want to emphasize the point that, as Dr. Seligman said earlier, that optimism and having the right mindset can have a big impact on resilience outcomes. And to give some examples, we know that when you have positive expectations, they can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Same with having a growth mindset. So that is, it's important to understand that resilience is not a personality trait like people used to think. It can actually be trained. And self-affirmation can also facilitate learning. So reminding yourself of past accomplishments can help because it provides evidence that you can do it. And so the take home here is that there's plenty of reason to have optimism and to have a positive mindset about resilience learning. So let me switch gears now and talk some about some specific resilience boosting strategies, particularly the top two here. I'll start by making the point that when we're faced with a stressor, the best thing to do is to confront and change the source of the stress directly, if at all possible. And we already talked about this, or I already talked about this a little bit. But the problem is often we're not really able to change the situation much. But fortunately, there are a host of additional strategies that can be helpful. And I'll focus on emotion regulation strategies first. So remember the important role of the prefrontal cortex in regulating our emotional brain? Well, as it turns out, humans can activate this network just with language. So we have a kind of a shortcut to activating prefrontal cortex, and it's just use of simple words. It so happens that emotional words activate a part of the prefrontal cortex, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, that can automatically recruit this coping network. So for example, saying the words, "I'm nervous," or "I feel sad," dampens emotional response as measured by amygdala activity or physiological arousal or self-report. And this benefit of labeling, affective labeling, can be seen in the short term and the long term. There was actually an interesting Twitter study that came out last year. They analyzed tens of thousands of tweets and found that when people tweeted an affective labeling statement like "I feel so awful," their subsequent tweets within minutes were less emotional. So this effect is also related to this concept of emotion disclosure. So disclosing your feelings about a bad experience, either by writing about it, in a journal or talking about it to a confidant has been shown across multiple studies that it can improve well-being in the long term. Conversely, suppressing emotions or completely avoiding them or being in denial about them or drowning them out with a drink is obviously harmful in the long term. And implications for police culture are obvious. So the stigma then against emotion expression and against seeking support needs to change, right? This approach is not healthy for the brain. So far, I've been talking about resilience building strategies that reduce amygdala and stress responses. And there are many strategies that involve this network. I already touched on a few of these, like stress inoculation. I didn't talk about all of them, but you can read more about them in my paper if you're interested. I provide references for all of the evidence. The only other strategy that I want to highlight now is cognitive reappraisal, because it's considered one of the most effective emotion regulation strategies. And it goes back to what Dr. Wild was saying a moment ago about reappraisals being important, or appraisals being important. Reappraisal basically means reframing or reinterpreting an event in a way that alters its emotional impact. And there are different ways to do this. One way is to find the silver lining. For example, reinterpreting a rough experience as an opportunity for growth, right? As an opportunity to strengthen those prefrontal coping connections. All the strategies that I'm listing on the screen here right now, in some way help downregulate the negative, right? So they help reduce negative emotions, they help reduce stress. However, this stress reducing pathway is not the only pathway we have for building resilience. There are at least 2 more pathways that I want to briefly go over. First, I want to talk about what's known as the dopamine reward network, or networks. Have more than one. These are the areas that respond when you find appetizing food or see a picture of a loved one. Depression and PTSD have been associated with decreased activity in this network, and stimulating neurons in the reward network has an antidepressant effect in animals and humans. And resilience strategies that activate this network have a general effect of making the person feel good. And so we have a whole bunch of strategies here. Obviously, I don't have the time to go over them. A huge one is optimism, as has been brought up already. Sleep and exercise, I can't overemphasize their importance in improving physical health, mental health, and prefrontal cognitive function, which we know is important for mental health. Social connectedness is another huge one. Decades of research have shown that the physical and mental health benefits of social support, and it includes not just having social support, but also giving it. And this is part of the reason access to supportive personnel and supportive leadership is so important. But even if you don't have that in your department, making the effort to spend time with loved ones, with family members or friends is critical, even though it may be challenging at times with everything that's going on. So I should say that activating the reward pathway also has the effect of buffering stress. And a lot of the strategies in this category both activate the reward network and reduce activation of the distress network. All right, so far we have a pathway that helps you feel less bad. That's the amygdala pathway that downregulates the negative. And then we have another pathway that helps you feel good, the reward pathway. And then there's an emerging third pathway that's about rising above all that. This pathway involves what's known as the default mode network, which is engaged when we think about ourselves, when our minds wander, when we ruminate about something bad that happened in the past over and over. And hyperactivity in this network is associated with mental illness like depression and addiction. And interventions that successfully treat these illnesses tend to normalize functional pathology in this network. And so disengaging from this sort of self-focused, excessive mind wandering or rumination about the past or worry about the future can be helpful. And one way to get there is through mindfulness. Dr. Denkova will cover that next. I'll just say here that mindfulness can have its positive effects through multiple pathways, not just the default mode pathway. Having purpose in life is also an important one. Having a sense of meaning or purpose in life has traditionally been deemed an integral part of psychological well-being. So this includes things like striving for a valued goal or having a larger project that you're working towards. For some people, this sense of meaning and purpose comes from religion, and numerous studies have shown the positive impact of religion on resilience. And one thing to note about this model here is that I'm not saying that you need to completely eliminate default mode or amygdala stress responses, or that you need to amp up the reward network as much as possible. That wouldn't make sense, because obviously addictive drugs really stimulate the reward network, but that's not adaptive. So everything in moderation is the idea.
Dr. Tabinia, you've got about a minute to go.
Okay, that's good. I can do this. All right.
Great.
Thanks. In conclusion, the roadmap to resilience that I've tried to paint goes something like this. We have learned from the brain that stress begets stress. So confronting stress now is easier probably than putting it off for later. And however, adaptive coping begets adaptive coping. So confronting stress now helps now and later. And we talked about some of these specific strategies. I just want to close by saying that the ideal strategy for resilience really depends on the individual and the situation. So it's not a one size fits all. In my papers, I try to provide a comprehensive overview of the best evidence-based strategies. And I provide all the relevant references about the evidence and about the underlying neural pathways if you're interested. And I hope that you'll be able to find something in there that's useful. You can find my papers on my website. The 2018 paper is written more for a more lay audience, for practitioners, but if you want more details, particularly about the default mode network, my 2020 paper has more on that. In conclusion, I want to thank everyone who helped put together this amazing symposium, and to all of you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, we got at least one, if not 1,000 different ideas from your presentation. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Now moving on to our last speaker in the panel, Dr. Denkova. Dr. Denkova is Assistant Professor and an Assistant Director of the Neuroimaging Facility at the University of Miami. I'll now hand over to her for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me share my talk. I hope that everyone can see.
Yes, perfect.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. And sorry. I'm very delighted to be part of this symposium and talk about bolstering resilience with mindfulness training. And thank you, Dr. Tabibnia, for making such a nice introduction about mindfulness. So the research that I will present today is feasible thanks to my wonderful teammates at the JALAP at the University of Miami. And just as a brief introduction to myself, I would like to say that I'm a cognitive and affective neuroscientist, meaning that I study the intertwined interactions between cognitive and affective processes. And my presentation today will focus on the impact of stress on cognitive and affective processes and how mindfulness training can promote resilience and therefore strengthen cognitive and affective processes. And finally, I will present some current research of mindfulness training implementation in high demand situations and high demand professions. So let me start with the impact of stress on cognitive and affective processes. And here I just would like to make a very quick note that when I'm talking about stress, I just mean it in a very broad terms, like the protracted periods of high demands and conditions that are characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, or VUCA conditions, like the current pandemic times that we are living in. And in such high demand and VUCA settings, what is happening? We start to perform poorly and feel bad. And why this happens? One of the reasons is that instead of staying on the now, meaning on the task in hand at the present moment, our attention drifts away And the mind starts to err to distracting affective thoughts, like ruminating about stressful past experiences, or having intrusive thoughts about traumatic experiences, or worrying about the future. And this maladaptive engagement with past and future oriented affective thoughts may endorse the negative impact of stress. So my first take-home message is that stress and VUCA conditions can degrade cognitive and affective processes. And what we can do about this is my second point. Adaptive response to stress is resilience. And here again, I'm defining resilience very broadly as the ability to maintain the capacities at risk of degradation in the face of challenges experienced during high stress or high demand periods. How to train resilience? There is growing evidence that mindfulness-based programs can be a promising tool to bolster resilience. And just briefly, what is mindfulness? Mindfulness can be defined as a mental mode characterized by attention to the present moment experience without conceptual elaboration or emotional reactivity. And from a cognitive perspective, there are two aspects that I would like to really highlight. The first one is paying attention to where attention is. And the second one is distancing from distracting affective thoughts. And I underline the word attention to highlight that attention is a very important key cognitive process. It's like a flashlight. It's a very powerful tool that everyone can learn to better control. And mindfulness training can help with that. And why is that possible? It's because mindfulness involves focusing and maintaining attention on the task at hand, meaning maintaining it on the now, on the current situation. And then noticing when the flashlight shifts away from the now and goes to those distracting affective thoughts, those ruminations about the past or intrusions about traumatic experiences or worries about what can happen tomorrow. And when this happens, when we notice that our mind is not on the now, then redirecting it gently back to the task at hand, to the now, to what is happening currently, what is the task at hand. So by repeatedly engaging in mindfulness practice, cognitive and affective processes can be strengthened and we can perform better and feel better. So my second take-home message is that mindfulness training can be a very promising resilience training tool and can strengthen cognitive and affective processes. But now the question is, if mindfulness is a useful resilience tool, how we can implement mindfulness training in settings or in situations where it's most needed, in VUCA professions or in professions with high demand, like policemen, firefighters, or military. And that's my third point, implementation of mindfulness training in high demand settings. And there are some considerations to keep in mind while doing research from that applied perspective. The first key question is how to accommodate time-pressured professions. Or in other words, if mindfulness training can be shortened, but still efficient. The second type of question relates to what type of program or content bolsters resilience. In other words, how does mindfulness compare to other programs? And the third question is how to improve scalability and acceptability of mindfulness training. And I will quickly mention, provide some answers based on our research. Short form mindfulness training is feasible when mindfulness practice is emphasized. Also, mindfulness training, when it's compared to relaxation training, can specifically bolster resilience. And I will show you that in a minute. And also, one efficient way of improving scalability and acceptability of the training is the train-the-trainer delivery of mindfulness, which means that people with expertise in the context that the training will be delivered can be successfully trained and then deliver efficiently the training program. To investigate those implementation questions, a mindfulness training program called MBAT, or Mindfulness-Based Attention Training, was developed by Dr. Amishi Jha and mindfulness expert Scott Rogers with a wonderful advisory group of military members and various mindfulness experts. MBAT is a 4-week program of 8 hours total with weekly 2-hour sessions and key daily mindfulness practice. And here on the slide, you can just briefly see the topics for each of the 4 sessions, as well as the type of mindfulness practice. But you can read more about the program in our more recent papers that are on the lab website. And so far, our research efforts have been directed towards investigating the impact of mindfulness training in various civilian and military settings, such as firefighters, soldiers, military spouses. And those efforts are still ongoing. But here I will quickly present a study that was recently published. And this study compared mindfulness and relaxation training in firefighters from the Miami-Dade Fire Rescue Department. And what we were able to see is increased resilience in the mindfulness training group only, meaning people who receive the 4-week MBAT program increased in their self-reported resilience. Moreover, we also found that greater mindfulness practice was associated with greater performance, cognitive performance, and also greater positive affect. And here I would like also to briefly mention that we also examined the impact of mindfulness training when the training program was delivered via the train-the-trainer model. And those findings were recently published in the Journal of Mindfulness, if you'd like to read more about the train-the-trainer delivery. And we have also another study following the same delivery approach in military spouses, with military spouses being trained and then delivering the training. So the take-home message from my third point are that short-form mindfulness training programs are efficient and can lead to benefits when mindfulness practice is emphasized. Second, mindfulness training can have specific benefits on resilience compared to relaxation. And finally, the delivery by context familiar trainers via the train-the-trainer model is feasible and efficient. And some quick take-home messages and tips just to reiterate the important aspects of this presentation is: pay attention to where your attention is. And when you notice those distracting, affective thoughts, distance from those. And if you'd like to read more about our current research, and also in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic, as well as all the other research in the military settings and in firefighters, you can go either to the Mindfulness website or the website at the lab. And on that note, I would like to thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Dr. Denkova. It's a fascinating presentation, and in wrapping up now in the last couple of minutes we have left, I was really interested to and happy to see the introduction of the concept of mindfulness and how that relates to resilience. And it's really important to remember how they go hand in hand, and your research showing us how they actually influence each other was fascinating. And to reflect on Dr. Dabinia's topic, as a counselling psychologist, we often forget about what goes on inside the brain as well as what's coming out of the mouth in therapy. So it was fantastic you put that on the agenda and really reminded us that what we psychologically experience has a physical impact. And what we think and feel really does have an impact on what goes on neurologically, and how that may either benefit or negate what we're doing, say, in therapy. And finally, Dr. Wild, I was really interested to hear how some things we assume will work. So psychoeducation, for instance, seems to make sense that it would have a positive impact. And fascinating to see, and this has happened across many policing topics, things that we commonly believe, actually, when we do the research and we collect the evidence, we find that actually there isn't a basis for that. And with limited resources in policing, this type of research, and I'm biased, of course, as an academic, but this type of research is so critical for police agencies and other first responder agencies that have limited resources. Where do we get the most value for our programs and training, and also the time of our officers investing in training as well. So in terms of wrapping up now for the session, I'd like on behalf of all the attendees at the session to thank our speakers very much. There is lots of questions in the question and answer section that unfortunately we don't have time to get to, but I would really encourage, as Jeff said, to reach out to each one of our panelists. If you do have some specific questions, go to the website, the Resiliency Symposium website. You'll find their research listed on that website, and links also to their profiles. And then I'm sure that they'd be more than happy for people to reach out to them and ask specific questions. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at some next sessions during the next 3 days.